So ko waio, hiuri tēnei no tūwhare tō, tūhui, ngai tarangi ngō Ngāti Kahungunu ki te Wairoa hoki, ko Zaine Akuhata-Huntington tōku ingoa. So no mai haere mai ki tēnei kaupapa, ko impacts of COVID-19 on Māori Ākonga across the tertiary education sector. If that's not a tongue twister, I don't know what is. So who are our Ākonga? I'm going to pass this over to Mamaeroa to talk about at the start. So kia ora.
Cool. Kia ora te whānau, ko Mamaeroa Merito ahau, huri tēnei no Ngāti Pikiao, Ngāti Whakawe, me Ngāti Awa. So before we dive into the statistics, breaking down the demographics of our tauira across the sector, I'm going to talk very briefly about Te Mana Ākonga. So you would have heard us mention it before, and hopefully it's a name that most of you will be familiar with. But Te Mana Ākonga is our National Māori Tertiary Students Association. We're composed of 14, the last I checked. It might have changed since I've left the role, but we had 14 student rōpū that are affiliated. And that the membership covered all of our 8 universities alongside a few polytechnics. So just to make it clear, we're predominantly focused in the university sector, although we do have connections, especially in our ITP sector. In regards to Te Mana Ākonga and the structure, the governance is overseen by our tumuaki. So in this beautiful photo here, you can see actually not even all of our, only a small percentage really of our membership. So this right here, sorry, I'm just so this photo right here was taken at our annual general meeting, and it is at our annual general meeting that the membership vote on the executive oversight over all of the issues that we will address for the following year. And so I don't want to say top, because that's not necessarily how we operate, but we have our 2 tumuaki alongside our kai hapai / secretary. So those are the ones who lead our organisation. Sitting alongside them, we then have a new development, which we've only had in the last 2 years, is our po. So in our instance, we had a po hauora, and that was Zaine. So he stepped in last year, I believe, and really looked after the hauora aspect of our organisation. And then alongside all of that, we have our kaiarahi. So each of our groups have different presidents that stand to represent them, and they come to the table and they bring their take, they bring their kōrero and the experiences of their tauira to this forum that we create, and we call it kaiarahi. And so it's a safe space for students, for Māori student leaders really, to collectivise, reflect on what needs work, and come together and set action plans and tasks. And that's, a very brief overview of Te Mana Ākonga. Now, we actually have a deep and rich whakapapa. So we have been guided over the years by different Māori student movements and rōpū. We even have an ex-tumuaki from one of our earlier iterations, which was the Māori Federation of Students, and that's actually Te Tiriti. So he was one of our tumuaki back then. So we have a really deep and rich whakapapa that extends well before myself, Zaine, Nohoro, and Kyle stepped into these roles. And we have quite a deep reach really across Aotearoa, with the rōpū up in Tamaki all the way down to Christchurch and Otago. And I'll chuck it over to Zaine to actually break it down a little bit more clearly for you guys. Kia ora.
Awesome. So this will just sort of be a brief overview of the demographic. It's not too exhaustive. Just sort of paints the picture a little bit. So the education counts data from 2019 show there was about nearly 77,000 Māori students in tertiary education. 2/3 identified as female and 1/3 identified as male. There's not a lot of data on gender diverse students, but they do note that just for anonymity reasons, they round to the nearest 5. So that could be an aspect as to why those students weren't included, because if they were, then they're going to be quite easily identifiable. But it's just something for us to be aware of when we're looking at our demographics, of the inclusivity that we have and making sure that everyone's experiences are included in those spaces. Looking at it by age, so majority of our students are 20 years or older, and again, more females studying than males across those age groups. But this sort of makes sense given sort of the population estimates of Māori. The average age sort of sits around about the 24 to 27 area. So we sort of see that coming in around these spaces here. So it makes sense that the demographic is shifted in this space. And where are they? So they're sort of split across 4 sectors from that data, which is our universities. So there's about a quarter of our students sit in the university space. Majority or most of them sit in the ITP space. So that's our Institutes of Technology and Polytechnics. They have our most Māori students in those spaces. Our wānanga have just under 20,000. So again, another quarter of our students are in the wānanga spaces. And then about 14,000 or 18% in private education providers. ITOs, interestingly, just sort of sit on the outskirts a little bit. They weren't included in this data as being fully within the tertiary sector. They're still noted as learners within that space, but the vocational training isn't quite included in there. I'm not 100% sure what the reasoning is for that. I'm sure that there's reason that they're sitting outside of that, and people here might have more knowledge on that area, but it's important to include them in there because, again, they make up 25,000 of our students in those spaces as well. So another key area that our tauira sit in. There's a few photo breaks in here because I know I hate seeing heaps of data and graphs and stuff, and it's just a chance for us to have a yarn with a pretty picture in the back as well. So like I said, it's not an exhaustive list of who our students are or where they're at. There's just some key attributes that we can be mindful of. Some things I would have liked to have been able to break down a little bit more, be iwi data, see where our students are coming from, who they whakapapa to, where they're placed exactly. It's quite hard in the tertiary sector because obviously people live in a certain area, so their census data might not match the data that we take in a survey and stuff because I move around the country when they go to different providers and things like that. And also intersectionality is becoming an interesting conversation. Especially when we're talking about ethnicity data. People don't just identify as Māori, they might just identify as Pacifica, they identify as New Zealand European, whatever that is. So we need to be mindful of the ways that that also impacts other aspects of everything we're talking about, and that might be in the education sector. We've got students that are on their journey with Te Māori, but also on their journey with their Pacifica identity as well, and the ways that they navigate through the systems in education and wellbeing and health and all those sorts of things. So this is sort of the overview of the findings. So this came from our 4 reports, just a casual plug there for those if you haven't seen them already. So there's 4 reports looking at the impacts of lockdown specifically during COVID-19 on 4 aspects or 4 sectors of tertiary education. So that was on university students, ITP students, industry training and private training. And all of them were focused on Māori learners and the impacts that they faced. 2 of those, the ITO and PTE reports, were done in conjunction with the Ministry of Education, for which we're very fortunate to be able to collaborate with them and have a partnership with them for those projects, because we don't have much of a developed student voice in those spaces because there's such a diverse student cohort and there's so many different entities within that space which students sit under. It's really hard to congregate them like we can in universities or in ITPs. So we're very lucky that the Ministry of Ed was able to use their channels to help us reach out into those spaces and get those voices and experiences growing and developing, and then turn them into those 2 reports down the bottom here. So again, another shout out to them. And these ones we did towards the start of lockdown, got as much data as we could, and then just life happens as it does. And the ITP one came out in December, but our first one was published in June from memory. So that's a bit of background about them. I'm just going to go over, I think there's about 4 key themes that came out of that data about the impacts of COVID and the lockdown. The first one was the sort of deficit framing of students and their whānau when it came to education in particular. And I've dropped into 2 quotes here that came from our tauira. We were very fortunate, and our sort of whole aspect was to share the experiences of our students directly and to get their stories in there, and not to use data on its own, to sort of be a bit mixed in the methods, I guess, and take their all their experiences and say, this is upfront what they're telling us. they're experienced, and here's the data that goes along with that as well. So I'll let you read those, but as you can see, there's a sort of conflict internally with a lot of students, with their values and just the things that they, I guess their things that they put first or prioritize. So for a lot of people, and it was a common theme, study was not what came first for them. It was family. Whānau came first, and they often felt that that was not made, or they were not encouraged for that to be a priority, that they should be putting their studies first and that their whānau should be supportive or that should be coming second. But as you can see, that's not the case. Their whānau came first. They wanted the education providers to be a bit more flexible around that, and not to say that it was their fault that they couldn't make lectures or that they shouldn't be taking up work shifts and all those sorts of things. They wanted to be understanding to know that actually I'm supporting a whole bunch of people. I need to be working because I need to support my whānau. I need to be working because I need to do this. And that actually education is coming second. I'll get my assignment done, but it's not at the top of my list at the moment, and those sorts of things. The biggest standout for probably myself and Mamaeroa as well, for people who have quite a passion for mental health, was the impacts that this had on people's mental health. We use the Kessler 10 scale, which some people might be familiar with. It's the same scale that was used in Te Tiriti, the mental health survey. It's been used a bunch of times. It's quite it's been validated, and sort of measures psychological distress. And it does that by looking at the past 30 days with a bunch of different questions, which are then scored. And as you can see, 1 in 3 students in both universities and ITPs were likely to be facing severe psychological distress. And this was in the 30 days during lockdown, which is very concerning for us. That's quite a high proportion of students, 1 in 3. And it means that they're scoring higher than 30, which is the upper threshold as well. And just some general sort of reports of feelings. We want just to gauge how students are feeling as well in general, how they're self-reporting on that. In universities, 1 in 2 feeling more sad, and 75% more anxious. Understandably, change in circumstances, more stresses, don't know what's happening with exams, with assignments, with graduation. And we saw similar things, not to as much of an extent in ITPs, but similar with those sort of emotions as well. We were wondering whether that was valid, or like whether that was going to be, could be replicated. And luckily there was another study done, not specifically with students, but with the general population. And this was by Every Palmer, who found very, very similar data, or very, very similar results. So they used 3 scales. They used the K10 as we did, the WHO5, and another scale, which I can't remember off the top of my head, but they too found that about 30% of their participants met the threshold for moderate to severe psychological distress. Nearly half of all their 18 to 24-year-olds scored highly, which was different to those aged over 65. So there was an inference there that as you got older, you were less likely to be more prone to poor mental health outcomes, I guess. 40% experienced poor well-being, and that came from the WHO5 scale. And that was above the previous national sort of average from data collected in 2018, 2019. So there definitely was some sort of impact that lockdown was having on not just Tuia, but people across the country. And also they found there was some elevated reports in suicidal ideation, but they needed to look into that a bit further to clarify whether it was just a general trend or whether it was particularly from COVID, because the last data was about 15 years old that looked at that. And I'm going to chuck it over to Mosey.
So just to touch on a few topics that Zaine said, you can see this data, but in a practical sense, what was actually happening was we were being inundated. Our executive was being inundated with our Māori student leaders who were having all these tauira coming to them with all these different problems. And they didn't know how to respond. So as lockdown was happening, there were some of our student leaders that had students that were coming to them that were depressed, and they didn't know what to do. And so that was a huge push for us to actually formalize their experiences in a way. So there had been instances in the past where we'd gone to leadership rōpū for help, but because it wasn't in an academic, it didn't have ethics approval or stuff like that, it was really hard for us to actually get people to listen to our voices. And so as lockdown was progressing and things were just getting worse for our tauira, we knew that we had to collectivise and put all of this kōrero into a report that could be used for good. And so, we have all this data here, but the stories that our students were telling us were the key focus in those quotes. And I'm really hoping that if you haven't read those reports yet, that you would go and do it straight after this session. But giving voice to these tauira and empowering them in the hopes that those in positions of power would help us, that was our key goal. But getting back to the slide, I realize I got a little bit off topic. In regards to education remains a financial burden. During the lockdown, we were expected, in regards to help, we actually had to get, and I'm sure most of you would know this actually, there was help offered to us, but we actually had to go into debt to get it. So we had an increase in the cap on our course related costs. And that was really unfortunate that, we were the only demographic in the country required to go further into debt to support ourselves during this lockdown. 33% reported increased financial stress. Another key thing was that, another key complaint coming through from our Māori student leaders was that many of our tauira didn't have laptops, access to equipment. We were so disadvantaged before lockdown had happened that, as it came upon us, it was just made apparent the differences that we had and the disparities in regards to the distribution of resources that we had. Another key point was that our ITP, ITOs and PTE students, they often had dependents. 1 in 5 uni students supported someone other than themselves. So there were all these problems coming through, and the only point at that time of relief was going into further depth. I'll chuck it over to Zaine to see if there's anything else he'd want to add on that point too.
Yeah, so just on that last point there, a lot of the students were saying that student allowance or their loan living costs, which come under StudyLink, were sort of their prime income sources. And I've just chucked in the data that I could find just from a quick search. So student allowance was about $275 per week. After tax, it could go into a student's pocket if they qualified for that, and it's a big if. And loan living costs, which is the student allowance equivalent sort of, but it means that you have to pay that back, so that goes onto your student loan, was $239. It was difficult to find sort of the average sort of rent cost because they're very fluctuative at the moment. But in 2018, I think Tertiary Property said that the median, and I stress that the median was $525 per week for a 2 to 4 bedroom place. Just in comparison, for me, my whare's 4 bedroom, but we're paying about $650 a week. And the consequence of that, or what we were saying, is that students were actually discovering that it was better for them to leave study and to go on the benefit than it was for them to stay in a position like this, because they were going to get more income from being on the benefit than they were staying in education. And for us, that's a huge red flag, that people felt that education wasn't a safe space for them to be in, or that they weren't supported to be continuing their education, and that they were better to be unemployed essentially to meet their costs during lockdown. Obviously, once lockdown finished and places could open back up again, they could go back into working. That alleviated the situation to a small degree. But I think it's important to note that a lot of students are on casual contracts when it comes to work, just because of how their study functions. They can't commit to full-time work a lot of the time, let alone, they can't commit to part-time work, let alone full-time work. So casual sort of tutoring hours or just jobs where they can pick up shifts every now and then works really well, but they didn't qualify at the time for the wage subsidy scheme because of that, or their employment was dropped, was what we were finding from their experiences. So that's just one of the ways that their financial burden was really impacting on the education, and obviously that also catalyses impacts on their health and well-being as well. The next thing that we found, which is a good thing, because not all of it was bad, was engagement with support services, but particularly with Māori support services. So we found that a lot of students thrived in their Māori environments pretty much. I love this quote in the middle here because it sort of encapsulates the general experience that our Māori students were facing, that when they were reached out or engaged with a Māori staff member, everything was all good. And often it was on the volition of Māori staff to do that, to get in touch with their students, to see what's happening, because they've built those solid foundations and relationships with them beforehand. They knew their students, they knew what they were up to, they knew where they were going, what's happening with their whānau, the difficulties that they were facing, and they just wrapped around them as we do, and it paid dividends for our students. They felt really supported by our Māori services. On the contrast, not so likely to engage with just sort of generic services. I sort of quote that because I don't like that term. All services should be functional for Māori, but there was quite a difference between students wanting to engage with Māori services and non-Māori services. So there's a good shift. And I guess we have to ask ourselves, well, why do Māori want to go to Māori services, and why aren't generic services attractive to Māori students? And there could be some reflections on those, maybe from the service providers themselves, as to why that's happening. Again, with ITOs and PTEs, a bit difficult to gauge their contact with support, because often this was coming from an employer or some sort of external sort of service. And there's also some concerns that there's not a lot of ability for them to advocate for themselves as students in those spaces. So obviously me and Mamaeroa have talked about how universities and some ITPs have student associations. A lot of students in vocational training or in PTEs don't have those sort of mechanisms to advocate for them and their needs. So that's a space that needs some development. And likewise, the accessibility to support networks specific for them is also a space that might need some development as well. And just to further elaborate on that last point I made about services themselves, we have to look at capacity as well. And this picture here came from an awesome paper done by Siriana again, which was the Pakaru pipeline, and looking at academic capacity within tertiary education, I guess. And what this was showing us, and this is representative of this picture of Māori students, was that at the end here in purple, for every 398 Māori students, there was one professor, one Māori professor, I should say, sorry. And just to contrast that, for Pacifica students, there was one Pacifica professor for every 1,829 students. And then to contrast that again with non-Māori or New Zealand European students, for every one professor, there was 95 students. So there's a big inequity there in terms of representation of our Māori students being reflected in their Māori staff. So there needs to be some conversations about how that capacity could be built, because obviously if students can't access those services because they're not available, because there's not the staff capacity for them to be able to operate, then there's some concerns about how that's going to impact not only on the education but on their health and well-being as well. And you can see that in counselling services, which are overwhelmed in a lot of spaces. There will be wait lists for 2 weeks onwards to see a counsellor in some spaces. So those sorts of things need to be developed, because we can imagine that's the capacity we're running at in academic staff. If we're looking at support staff, it's probably going to be less than that again. And this is sort of the key sort of aspects, I guess, of what this talk will be about. Some challenges and slightly less challenges, opportunities, if you want to use that terminology, from it all. So what were the lessons that we were taught, or what are some things that have been reinforced in these spaces? I make no apologies for some of the language used in these slides. It's purposefully inflammatory just to get us thinking about it, because I think it's important we be comfortable having these conversations. So the first one we saw is that education's still a privilege in Aotearoa. So it's not a right. We're still seeing huge student loans. Like you said, to get support during lockdown, you had to go into debt. So it's still a privilege. We're still lucky that we have access to this education, but it still comes at a cost. So it's that burden that sits with us. there's still quite an individualistic approach to education within Aotearoa, and it obviously operates in a Western system as well, with some exceptions. And I look to our wānanga as sort of the gold standard for education for Māori students in particular. This concept of white ownership of education, so these systems were not built by us. Our tertiary systems, our universities, these are not concepts that are founded in Te Ao Māori, our wānanga, those sorts of spaces, the way we operate, that is how, those were the things that were passed down from our tupuna to us. And also when it comes to defining education and excellence, I'll touch on it a bit later, but when we talk about education and excellence in these spaces, we've got to ask ourselves, who's defining what excellence is? And is that Māori excellence, or is that Pākehā excellence, or is it non-Māori excellence, or those sorts of things? A lot of our marginalised communities and Māori still face barriers to tertiary education, and that's that sort of pipeline from primary school to secondary education into tertiary. So we need to be looking at that whole pipeline, and then conversely looking at tertiary education into the workforce as well, and the barriers and opportunities that are in all of those spaces, and how we're making sure that there's equitable access and equitable outcomes across that entire pipeline, not just at certain points, because you can have a whole pipeline that's flowing with water, but if you've got a leak, eventually that's just going to keep growing and growing and growing, and divert all that water out of that pipeline and into somewhere else. And lastly, recognition of mātauranga Māori and rangahau Māori as valid. Just because it's not published in a journal doesn't mean that it's not valid. And I'm sure my nanny will tell all of you that. You listen to the word she says and you make sure you hear it. So you get a smack around the ears. Peer reviewed, and that's just talking with one another, knowing that the conversations that we have at wānanga is sort of a peer review process in itself, to me, that we're bouncing those ideas off, we're debating, we're discussing, and we're just ironing out everything flat so we can see it for what it is and really just go in. And also that it's pioneering, that Māori can be at the forefront of education. And I just looked to our tupuna for that, who use the stars to navigate to Aotearoa. And then you look at the many, many iterations of GPS technology within a Western framework. We can still go back to our stars and use that to navigate. We don't need Google Maps or whatever to do those sorts of things. So we've been pioneers from the start. This one is talking about sort of intersectionality again. When we talk about education and wellbeing, in my experience, there's a little bit of overlap. So it's sort of a bit of a Venn diagram. I apologize, I'm not a diagram person. I'm not good at it. And these are just sort of things I chuck in. From my experience, things that I've heard. When we talk about well-being, we think about exercise, eating healthy, you've got a warm flat, good mates, those sorts of things. Education, you're doing well, you've got good grades. You graduate, you've got your qualification, you went to a mean school, you got scholarships. And if both of those are overlapping, you've got a passion for the things you're doing, you might be taking up leadership positions, you might be making heaps of money. We use those as markers or measures of success. But for me, that's not the case, and that's not what it should be. They shouldn't be these two separate things with some overlap here. They're actually one and the same and should operate in that way. And the way that I visualize that is sort of this, I guess it's like a river, sort of a journey of a river. You've got the source, which starts up in the mountains, and that's where we get our resourcing, the knowledge, the diversity. Our workforce starts and then it contributes to this river, so this river of education, this river of well-being. We get to the journey where we've got our ups and downs with our health, with our education. Like me, I fell in and out of the tertiary sector because I just lost passion for it and then went back in, just those sorts of things. You've got rapids in a river, which we can see as being really good progress, really fast progress where things are moving quickly. We're making way in those spaces. But also we've got some stagnant pools of water where things are not moving at all. And then you've got this algae or didimo or bacteria that's growing, that's polluting that sort of space, and it's not fresh, it's not clean, it's not good for us to drink out of or to consume or to take on and those sorts of things. And then it continues out to this last point, to the mouth, out to the moana. And then for me, that's the sort of idea of reciprocation. So it gets out there. All those things that we brought right from the source, the things we've collected along our journey, and then out to the moana where it's dispersed. to our communities, to our whānau, to our iwi, to our hapu, to our students in education. And then it's reciprocated by that sort of evaporation, which then goes back, if you remember the water cycle from primary school or high school, and turns back into snow, into the source. And the reason I sort of use that metaphor is because everything we put out there, the things we produce, so if we're producing more Māori academics, if we're producing more Māori research, if we've got a growing student population, that impacts our children that are coming later on. So we go back and we become the teachers of our students, we become the doctors, we become the nurses, we become the builders, we become all those things, and we go back and we contribute to that source, and it just becomes this ongoing cycle where hopefully it's all growing and developing, and that's for education and well-being. They go hand in hand in that thing. And then flicking back to COVID, what are some of the ongoing consequences? Obviously, there's still those persistent levels of uncertainty. No one's really sure what's happening at any given time. Will there be another lockdown? For students, they're always thinking, oh, are our classes going to switch to online? Or are they going to be in person? Where are we meeting? For students that have got placements or employment sort of things that they need to be thinking about, are they going to be able to carry them out in those spaces? Are they going to be attached to a hospital? Are they going to be stuck in that space if they get shunned to another lockdown? Or our Auckland students have faced this throughout the year, having been through this a few times now. The rest of the country can operate normally, but they're stuck at home with online learning and those sorts of things. So it's in the back of our students' minds. There's an increasing demand for employment, but a limited supply. So again, that's talking about that sort of issue of job security. And it was found in the Arataki report that students and young people are probably the most likely to be affected by this. And that is people graduating, wanting to go out to the workforce, but actually people have scaled back the amount of graduate opportunities they have or internship positions. So there's now increased competition for those positions. And then it starts impacting things like, well, how are we measuring which people are the best to get these positions? Are you going off academic grades? Are you keeping to your principles of diversity or commitment to Tiriti and those sorts of things? And then obviously if you don't get employment, that's putting that financial strain back on you again. And lastly, the health repercussions. So the mental health impact, we're still unsure what these are going to look like. Is it going to be similar to what we've seen with the Christchurch earthquakes or with the Moss terrorist attacks? We just don't know. I'm sure there'll be research and development at the moment that's looking at this and will continue to look at this, but it's something to be mindful of. But also there's an opportunity here for a shift towards iwi and hapu informed care. I mean, we saw with all the lockdowns, the checkpoints that were put in place, marae-based care, food packages and parcels, all those sorts of things being done for the communities, and they were just done because they needed to be done. And those sorts of approaches, that community orientation, could be the way forward, or it's an opportunity for it to develop in Aotearoa. And just to make sure it's not all doom and gloom, here are some good points that came out from it. And I'll let Mosey talk about the sort of resilience from our Ākonga Māori, especially our student associations, because they really did put in the hard yards in these spaces during lockdown. So over to you, Mosey.
So in regards to our student associations, they were very quick on their feet, I'll give you that. So if you remember, we had not too much of a warning really that our country was going into lockdown. And so many of our student associations were successful in lobbying their institutions to give them funds to get students home. Because we recognise, and Zaine touched on it, the importance of whānau to us. Majority of our students wanted to go home and spend that time with their whānau. So in that instance, yeah, our student associations managed to get most students home. And that, yeah, in some instances that, you know, when it came to studying and that, it was a bit tricky for some, and that came through in our reports in regards to sharing a home with multiple family members in comparison to staying alone in an isolated student apartment. But for the most part, that was one of the most important things, was getting our tauira home. And so we were very lucky to have our Māori student leaders, for the most part, be able to lobby our institutions to support them to do that. In some instances, and I touched on it really briefly before regarding financial burden and on our tauira, when our student associations couldn't actually meet the needs of their tauira, we were very lucky to have connections with some of our iwi organisations. So one I do want to touch on was our whānau ora paiarahi. So there were students that were coming through and presenting to their student associations that had exhausted everything. They had exhausted the hardship funds. They've gotten the maximum amount of food packages they could get from their Māori Student Association. And when that had run out, we actually turned to whānau ora, in particular Te Pūtahitanga down south. They were amazing in making sure that our students had kai on their table once they had exhausted all the resources our associations had. And so that was something about us as we're not just limited to just the tertiary sector. You know, as Māori, we have big networks of support, really. And so in moments of real need, we looked outwards. And so I'm really grateful for whānau ora in that instance, for having paiarahi there that took over when our student leaders just didn't have the means and the capacity to do so themselves, or when they'd exhausted everything. And it's unfortunate that that happened, you know, that we actually had to look outside of our sector and to, you know, to whānau ora for help, and that our needs weren't ultimately being met in our own institutions or by the government. So that was something that was, yeah, good and bad in a sense. I'll pass it back to Zaine to finish up if there's anything else I haven't touched on.
No, there's a good summary of it all. And these are just some of the aspects that were highlighted through some of the feedback that we got. And what's a Te Tiriti seminar without a dig at the Crown for placing us in further debt. So that was one of the key things, was that these spaces did create support funds for students that made sure that, yep, there was an option that if they wanted to or had to, they were going to go into debt, but actually we weren't going to operate like that, and we were going to wrap around our students and make sure that they were supported in a way that they needed. And they had processes for doing that, to making sure that appropriate amounts of support were allocated to students based on individual need, which is really good. Likewise, we saw postgrad students, some suggestions that those numbers will increase, which hopefully will impact what we were talking about previously with the lack of diversity in workforce. And this is an opportunity for that to happen, and for providers to grab onto those students who may not have job opportunities waiting for them, to say, look, there's a job here for you, or there's a succession plan here for you to come into these spaces and start growing Māori academia within an institution. And lastly, just that chance to sort of reform, reset, and innovate, because this is that chance to begin again, I guess, to start anew. We've had all these shifts and all these shake-ups, and now that the dust is, touch wood, settling, we can start to grow again, and innovate and pioneer. And this is just a picture from one of our hui kaiarahi, where we get together the student leaders of the associations. And this was in Waikato in 2019, from the top of my head. Mosey might be able to confirm that or not. But this was on Gumboot Day. So this was a mental health kaupapa that was sort of analogous to treading through mud. So that depression was like treading through mud. So you had your gumboots on to support that. And this just for me highlighted that students can lead and will lead, whether or not you give them the opportunity to. If there's something they're passionate about, they're just going to take that arco and run with it. But also that they're capable, they're willing, and they're very passionate about the things that they're wanting to do as well. And that their experiences and they're valid, although a lot of people see students as being young in their spaces. It's not quite the case. And our data showed that a lot of them have a lot of life experience, that are sitting above 25, 30, 45. We've even got a lot of students sitting in the 60 plus category who bring a whole wealth of knowledge and experience with them, and just given the right kaupapa or the right opportunity, by far going to lead by example, and make a difference, and a meaningful difference as well. So this is just an opportunity for me and Mosey to have an off-script rant about anything that we've thought about on the way. Because this often happens and we haven't had the chance to sit down with each other face to face and just yarn about this stuff. So this is just that time for us to wānanga, to have that wānanga about a few things. So I'm going to let Mosey go first.
I think one key thing to note though is if you saw the reports is that you would have noticed that our whare wānanga was missing. So we're fortunate enough to have the Ministry of Education set up a meeting with representatives from each of the whare wānanga, and we presented our proposed research to them, and they respectfully told us no, that they didn't want us to come in and do research and write a report, and that they were quite content with the relationships that they had with their own students. They were sure that they had a good grasp on the experiences of their tauira and how to meet their needs. So that is one big gap that we have in regards to all of our reports. If you were to line them up, that's one sector that's missing. But respectfully, we had a good wānanga with them, and we understood where they were coming from, and we understood that the relationship that our whare wānanga and Māori staff there have with their tauira is completely different to the structure that our university students are in. And so that was one gap that I think some people have noted. I will add to that though, it was unfortunate. We really did want to try to capture their capture their experiences to add weight to this collective kōrero that we had from across the sector. But I guess in regards to the mahi for Te Mana Ākonga, it's about building those relationships, and one day I'm sure they'll trust us enough to actually let us go in and wānanga with their tauira. But it's all about building those relationships and those connections. I'll pass it over to Zaine if there's any other reflections he has as well.
No, I definitely agree with that point. It was a beautiful opportunity to get to talk to our whare wānanga, because for me and my thoughts is that those are the spaces where it's just in and out Māori, by Māori, for Māori, holds Māori values. It's just lives and breathes Te Ao Māori. And for our Māori students, I think they had already sort of felt like they were well supported in those spaces. And they're just a very, very different cohort, a lot of home-based learning sort of things, and just a different approach in general. So I actually think if they had been included in this generalisation, it wouldn't have been very beneficial. That actually wānanga themselves are just a great example of ways that education can be different in the tertiary sector. That there's aspects of that can be integrated into other spaces. And likewise, there's probably a reciprocal relationship there as well. But it was at the time appropriate that wānanga were like, no, actually, I think we've got this. And it was great to see that happen, and for them to be confident that actually, no, we've got a great relationship with our students. We're engaging with them, and we know what they want, what their needs are. So we're very fortunate to have had that discussion. In terms of sort of what do we do from here? Everything I go to as a Māori, I often find I'm always getting these questions. Oh, well, I'm a non-Māori. What should I be doing in these spaces? La da 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 da. So I haven't given the golden ticket to it all. These are some of the quotes that came out of those reports. That last one there sums it up in literally a sentence. They did a great job supporting us academically, but not culturally or personally. And that's a pretty key theme. And I think a lot of people will relate to that, not just in education or health or well-being, but also just in their lives in general, in the workplace and those sorts of things. So it's not sort of our job or our responsibility as Māori to be the solution to those issues, nor is it appropriate, because a lot of the time we didn't create those inequities or those issues in those spaces. So these are some of the questions that I sort of think that we should be asking ourselves as providers or as support people in those spaces for our Māori students. Who are they? What are their needs? What barriers exist? What opportunities? What's important to them? Not what is important to us or what outcomes do we want? What is important to our students and what do they want? Because it might not be education orientated at all. And we need to be aware of that. And what can we do? Not what can the students do for us. Let's not get the students up and do a kapahaka festival for us. That'll show that we love our Māori students. It's what can we do that actively shows that we care for our Māori students and that we value them. But breaking that down further, is it mana enhancing? Is it culturally competent and culturally safe? Have we consulted with the students about these things that we can do? Or have we just decided, yep, we're going to run with this. This is a mean idea. And then it falls on its face and it doesn't happen, yeah? And lastly, is it meaningful? Is this a meaningful relationship that you're building with these students? Or is it just an act of kindness, an olive branch that you're reaching out? and making peace with, I guess. And if there's anything that sticks with you with that one, it's that last one. Get sexy with your situation, get intimate with it, know your students, know your context that you're sitting in, and just be really familiar with it and comfortable in that space as well. And lastly, how can we support their learning? These are the questions, again, that we'll be asking about institutions or providers themselves. So what are our values? What are our goals? And who decided these? Who consulted on the production and implementation of them? The knowledge that leadership in particular bring with them, people that are sitting in positions of power, are they from New Zealand? Do they understand the New Zealand context and the obligations of Te Tiriti? If they're not, they need to be made aware of that. They need to know those things. They need to be aware that we're operating in Aotearoa, we have Te Tiriti, and you need to be aware of the things that you need to uphold within that space. And it's not the treaty, we're going back to Te Tiriti now. How they're actively committed. A great tool is Heather Kane's, Anna Sullivan's, and Tim McKenna's critical Tiriti analysis, which is often used for policy, but is a good tool that could be used in other spaces. But that leads us to the sort of policy rhetoric as well, which is actions speak louder than words. You can have it written down, you can have a mean policy or a mean framework or whatever, but if you're not putting that into action and there's no measurable outcomes from that, well, there's no meat on your bones and it's no good. Being reflective on the power dynamics and your positionality. So often you'll hear, oh, well, that's not what my students have said, or that's not what we're hearing, or that's not what the data says. Well, why doesn't it say that? It's probably because you're sitting in a power structure, there's a hierarchy, people don't feel comfortable being honest or true in those spaces, especially Māori. They don't know you a lot of the time. And if they do know you or you've got a relationship with them, they're probably more comfortable to have those conversations. So be aware of that, of where you're positioning yourself in those spaces. Back to that point about mātauranga Māori, Māori excellence being recognised. And lastly, are we resourcing Māori and Māori initiatives equitably? And my last point would be in identifying our key stakeholders. If you didn't say students, you need to reevaluate your choices because those are our key stakeholders, okay? Give our students the tino rangatiratanga, give them that self-determination, the mana, to be directors of their own education. And don't be a crusty old vampire. If there's anything you take from this, don't be a vampire. Don't suck the life out of our tauira, out of our ākonga. Yeah, that's it. And to end, you get to look at our beautiful faces while we switch to part-time. I'm really sorry we went over time, but yeah. Kia ora koutou. Anything from you, Mosey?
Just one thing to add before we go on to part-time. I actually just want to state this, that if you look at the reports, one thing to note is that we weren't financially supported to do any of this. So we did all of this out of aroha in regards to the work, especially Zaine. So you would have heard how he spoke. He carried a lot of this with Te Mana Ākonga with our support. But that was one thing regarding all of this kōrero, is we did all of this out of the goodness of our hearts. And two were written completely by Zaine. That was our ITP and our university report. And then the other two were actually done with the support of the Ministry of Education. So that was Lauren Bell and Aisha Hancock's in particular. But even in that capacity, having them step on, that we were still limited. We still didn't actually have funds to help support this. So we're quite impressed with what we managed to put together and the kōrero that we managed to collect and how we've pushed for it to be put to use.
Nā reira, kia ora rau wā te kōrua, Zaine kōrero ko Mamaeroa. Ka rawe hoki i nā kōrero, i nā rangahautanga,